Hi everybody, how are you guys doing today? Thank you guys, thanks for having me here, and thank you guys so much for coming. I've been really looking forward to this. I'm going to be talking today about A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, as well as the fantasy genre in general, and the process of writing a fantasy novel. So first thing, a little background, who I am. That's me. I was going to put it all like professional grown-up shot, my author shot, and then I figured I'm standing here in front of you, you know what I look like. So this is me, age 2, discovering that books are for more than just chewing on. I have always loved books. Books are these magic things. I mean, they have the power to transport you to another world, to take you out of where you are and put you in somewhere else. And that doesn't necessarily need to be another world, literally, like an Earthsea or a Middle Earth or anything like that. It can just be, you know, some kid in California or down the street, but you get to be taken out of where you are and put into somebody's heart and soul. And I think that is magic. And I have always wanted to be a part of making that magic. And that's why I became an author. That's why I'm a writer. And specifically why I write fantasy. These are my books. The first 2 are Into the Wild and Out of the Wild. They're basically fairy tale characters escape the fairy tale and they live in secret in our world. The next one I did is Ice, and that's Beauty and the Beast meets Arctic Adventure. She's an Arctic research scientist, he's a talking polar bear. Enchanted Ivy is about getting into college where the gargoyles talk and you ride your dragons and the guys turn into were-tigers, you know, the usual college experience. And my newest one, which just came out a couple weeks ago, and I'm very excited about, is called Drink, Slay, Love. And I'll be reading you a little bit from that later on. So, just to make sure we're on the same page, what is fantasy? How would you guys define fantasy, like the genre? Yeah?
Fantasy is a type of fiction where the characters and the plot necessarily doesn't have to be something you see in your everyday life.
Perfect, yeah.
It's a concept of surrealism.
Yeah, surrealism. Anybody else want to add in that? Yeah?
It's not real.
It's not real. Yeah, Yeah, creatures and dragons and fake characters. Those are all perfect answers. For me, I define fantasy as something where something happens that could never happen. Like something impossible happens, as simply as that. It can have wizards, it can have dragons, it doesn't have to. It just has to have something impossible. Some of the things, oh yeah. So that's unicorn meat. I gave that to my brother for his birthday, and it just amused me so much I had to put it in the slide. And it comes inside the can with this dismembered unicorn doll, which I think is awesome and just wrong on so many levels. Some of the traits that fantasy tends to have, not always, is that it tends to have an optimistic worldview. There's this theme of the little guy conquers the massive evil, love conquers all, if you have friends you can defeat Voldemort, you know, that kind of thing, which I really love. I really identify with that optimism. It also has this sense of empowerment, you know, that you can go out and conquer that giant evil thing. And it grants power to the powerless, which is one of the things I just love about the genre. It also is a genre where something happens. It's not, you know, you're not sitting around thinking, oh, I wish that boy would smile at me. That sort of thing. Exactly. You go and you do something. You know, something's wrong in your life, you walk through the magic whatever and get the thing. So that's the other reason. Other thing that defines what fantasy means to me. Types of fantasy. So I just totally made up. These are not like official categories, I just made this up. You have your here-be dragons kind of thing. These are the immersive fantasy where you go into a secondary world and you're surrounded by it. Wizard of Earthsea is one such fantasy. You're in this whole world, it surrounds you. There's no Manhattan, there's no US, there's no planet Earth. You're someplace else, Middle Earth, Earthsea, Narnia, something like that. Actually, Narnia's Portal Panel. But anyway. Then you have what I call bunny escapades. These are your talking rabbits and you're talking whatevers, like Watership Down, Redwall, things like that. Yeah.
You know that book called Nicola?
Yeah, Nicola, I love that one.
I read that last year.
That is a fabulous book. It's about a vampire bunny. It is brilliant. Another type of fantasy you can have is a fractured fairy tale, where you're looking at a fairy tale from the character's point of view, like Ella Enchanted. And you're the book is, read the book. The book is fabulous. Movie, not so good. They like break out in song and dance. It's wrong. But the book is awesome. Yeah, the next one I call Fairies in the Coffee Pot. This is like fantasy in the real world. And these are things like Spiderwick Chronicles or Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare. Or Diane Duane's the Young Wizards series, so you wouldn't be a wizard in deep wizardry, which is awesome. Yeah. Twilight, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Twilight, where there's magic, but you're in the real world, and there's that juxtaposition of the fantasy and the reality. Through the Wardrobe is like portal fantasy. You start in the real world, and you walk through the looking glass. You walk through the wardrobe, and you're in Narnia or Wonderland or some other world, and that person's a kind of a fish out of water thing. And the other kind, which I called Everyone Wears Corsets, is historical fantasy, like Libba Bray, where you have, it's like Victorian England or something, yet there's magic. And it's the real world of the past, but with something impossible fused in. So those are different types of fantasy. What kind of fantasy do you guys like to read? What are some of your favorites? Yeah?
I like Twilight and Search.
Cool. Twilight, Search for Freak. In the back there? Yep.
I like the Mortal Instruments, Infernal Devices, Hush Hush, Crescendo, House of Night.
All awesome. Yeah?
The Valeria Todd series.
Oh, those are awesome. Yeah?
I like the Harry Potter series and the Pendragon series.
Harry Potter rocks. Yeah?
I like the Nicola and I like the Cinderella stuff.
Yeah. That's good. Hunger Games. Ooh, Hunger Games is cool. I can't wait for that movie. It's going to be interesting. Hunger Games is dystopian. Personally, I do characterize that as fantasy. Because it's a something impossible happens. And you can make an argument that science fiction in general can be classified as fantasy. Some science fiction tries really hard to be very rigorous with the science, but some is a little softer, like Star Wars. I believe Star Wars is fantasy because you have the whole Force and all of those elements that take it into the fantastical realm. But there are people, some of my science fiction writer friends would get mad at me for saying that, but I consider it all under fantasy. And definitely Hunger Games, I think, falls under there. Yeah? In Hunger Games, it's a world that doesn't exist. That's why. They don't necessarily have, they don't have magic, they don't have the wizards or whatever, but they have that impossible element. It's not here. It's not happening. It's never happened. Hopefully it never will happen. So that's what throws it into fantasy. Yeah?
I like Iron number 4. I like Beast. I think it's Beast. And the second book, and that's by the same author.
Cloaked, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Oh, you guys have good reading taste. Yay. Yeah?
I like Vampire.
Uh-huh. Yeah?
Everything everybody said and the Maximum Ride series.
Maximum Ride series, yeah?
How do you determine the difference between science fiction and fantasy?
Oh my gosh, there's so many debates on that. Science fiction and fantasy, usually it's an excellent question, and people have gone on and on about this. I'll try not to go on and on. Usually it's by the tropes. Like science fiction frames itself by saying, there's a scientific explanation for what's going on. I'm going to extrapolate from what's here and now and say, this could happen, this is possible. Whereas fantasy is asking you to suspend your disbelief and just take a leap. Like, here's this element, it can never happen. Deal with it, move on, this is a story. Now, there are vampires in town. We don't go into the background of how these vampires were born. Have any of you heard of Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series? It's this other world where, called Pern, where they have dragons. And it looks on the surface that it's a fantasy, but it is often classified as science fiction because she goes back in the later books and gives a scientific explanation for the people settled Pern, they came in on spaceships, and they created the dragons in laboratories. And that pushes it into science fiction because it gives a scientific explanation for the magic. Yeah, like Planet of the Apes. Yes. You don't normally have talking apes, but they give an explanation. Alright. I love you guys having such good taste in books. This makes me so happy. Alright, hold on. I'm going to move on. Hold your questions for a second. So, why write fantasy? There are lots of reasons people choose to read fantasy and write fantasy. This is what Ursula K. Le Guin says in her book Language of the Night. She's responding to some hypothetical guy in a business suit who's poo-pooing fantasy as just for being for kids. Dragons and hobbits and little green men, what's the use of it? The truest answer is, the use of it is to give you pleasure and delight. And then if the guy doesn't accept that answer, she said the next to truest answer is, the use of imaginative fiction is to deepen your understanding of your world and your fellow men and your own feelings and your destiny. And I think that that's very true. I think that fantasy, why read fantasy? And my answer to that is because it's awesome. I mean, why wouldn't you read it? There's cool stuff happening. It's great. I think there is value in escapism. There is value in taking you out of what you're in and taking you on a journey. That your soul can grow while that character grows. That you can travel this route with them. Even if you can never ride a dragon, even if you'll never meet a vampire, you can do it in your mind through these books, journeying with these characters. And I think that's awesome. So that's my explanation for why fantasy. Other thing she said, which I kind of did in a smaller font, sorry. A scientist who creates a monster in his laboratory, a librarian in the library of Babel, a wizard unable to cast a spell, a spaceship having trouble in getting to Alpha Centauri. All these may be precise and profound metaphors of the human condition. The fantasist, whether he uses the ancient archetypes of myth and legend or the younger ones of science and technology, may be talking as seriously as any sociologist and a good deal more directly about human life as it is lived and as it might be lived and as it ought to be lived. It is, above all, by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. A lot of fantasy, and I'm including science fiction in this, is allegory. We're talking about the human condition, even if we're talking about hobbits and little green men and whatever. We're talking about the experience that everybody goes through. And we're pushing it to extreme. That's one of the awesome things that fantasy lets you do, is to take something in the real world and push it to its boundaries and do it in this allegorical, cool way, and talk about this. So in a way, it's a very subversive kind of literature, because you're talking about, you know, like, has anybody read Philip Pullman's Golden Compass in that series? Yeah, that's a discussion of religion, and specifically a critique of organized religion, but it's pushed to the extreme, and it's disguised in that Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, direct allegory for Christian mythology, for the whole, you know, Jesus thing. And it's discussed in this allegorical fashion, which is cool. Last thing she says about fantasy that I thought, well, she said a lot about fantasy, but the one I picked out that I thought was really cool. For fantasy is true, of course. It isn't factual, but it's true. And that, I believe, is what the heart of good fantasy is. If you're writing about real characters going through real experiences, it doesn't matter all the crazy stuff that's going on. You can go on that journey with them. And you're talking about true things. It is by such statements as, once upon a time there was a dragon, or in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. It is by such beautiful non-facts that we, fantastic human beings, may arrive in our peculiar fashion at the truth. And I think that is, she said it much more articulately than I would, but I think that is absolutely true. Is we're writing about truth. Even as we're writing about vampires in high school, or whatever it is we're writing about, we are writing about truth, and it's coming from that place. Why I write fantasy. Okay, this is totally cheesy, but I completely believe that being a writer is the closest you can get in this world to being a wizard. Because, and I know, totally cheesy, but I really believe it because you're casting spells. What you're trying to do is, through your words, create this moment of telepathy, of taking this dream in your head, this story, these people that don't exist in this world that could never happen, and put it into the head of someone you will never meet, purely through the words strung together on a page. And I think that is magic. And I think what you're trying to do is perform that spell of taking somebody out of their world and walking them on this journey that they will never have gone on their own, and walking with them on their journey. That's why I write fantasy, because I want to do that. Words are immensely powerful things. I mean, the whole sticks and stones may break your bones, but words, that's like the biggest lie that anybody ever told in cliche. Words can destroy you, and words can also build you up. They can empower you. And I believe books can do that too. You probably noticed I'm putting cover art from Wizard of Earthsea throughout the presentation. She had all sorts of different covers for the book as it came out. I find that fascinating. Little side note. One of the themes in Wizard of Earthsea is the power of words, the power of names. The whole magic system in the book is built around how names can transform things. And if you know the true name of something, then you can change it, you can influence it. Have any of you guys actually read Wizard of Earthsea yet? I don't believe you had. Okay, let me give you a bit of background on it. It is one of the classics in fantasy literature. It came out in like late 60s, I want to say, about 20 years after Lord of the Rings. And it is the first time that a wizard was shown becoming a wizard. Now, usually you would have like the Merlin or the Gandalf kind of figure, Dumbledore essentially, the older man with a long white beard and the pointy hat with his magic wand or magic staff or whatever. She did the first wizard school. She is this book, Wizard of Earthsea, is one of the giants of the field, even though it's kind of short. It's one of the giants of the field of which a lot of modern novels stand on. So it's really kind of a formative piece, and it's about this young boy, Jad, also called Sparrowhawk, and how he became a wizard, and how he deals with this massive evil that he unleashes in the beginning of the novel. He goes on all these fantastic quests, and there are dragons, which are awesome. Anything with dragons in my book is awesome. And it is also an allegory for being a writer and being an artist. She actually said herself, wizardry is artistry. And it's an allegory for the creative process, for creating art and the power of words throughout it. And I believe that when you write, you're casting a spell. And that's what Wizard of Earthsea does, and that's what it discusses. And I know that's what I try to do with my writing. So I want to talk for a bit about how one goes about writing a fantasy novel. Do any of you guys like to write? Yay! Do any of you guys like to write fantasy? Awesome. People that don't like to write, why not? It's awesome. You gotta try it. It'll be good. I swear. Writing is not some magical thing. One thing that commonly freezes up people when they sit down to say, I'm going to write a story, or I'm going to write a novel, I'm going to write a poem, or whatever, is that you start comparing yourself to finished work that's sitting there on the shelf, or songs you hear on the radio, or things you read, or movies you see, or whatever. Those are finished works. It's completely unfair to compare your beginning to that, and you will freeze yourself up if you do that. Writing is a process, and it can be done in steps. You don't end up with a finished product right away. It's sort of the whole climb a mountain, take a single step. If you want to eat an elephant, do it bite, 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 and that kind of thing. Steps you can take. Now, every writer has different process, because all of our brains work differently. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, please. This is what works for me. So, okay, the first thing I do, step one, before I write anything, is to have an idea. This is kind of key. Otherwise, you're staring at a blank page. Now, where do ideas come from? Yeah?
Your everyday life.
Your everyday life, perfect. Yeah, in the back?
Imagination.
Imagination, yeah.
Your thoughts?
Your thoughts. Yeah? Movies. Songs. Other books. Okay, so it's good. Yeah?
Your heart.
Your heart. It's a beautiful answer. It's absolutely true for all of them. Ideas really come from everywhere. They can come from people you meet, things you see, dreams you have, books you read, movies you see. Ideas can come from everywhere. Personally, I find that one of the most useless bits of writing advice ever. Because if ideas can come from everywhere, where do you start? Sit down and you're like, okay, I can write anything. Great. What do I do? So there are a couple tricks that writers can use to start the well flowing, to get ideas. One of them is that you can react to prior literature, things that came before it. For instance, Harry Potter is all about a wizard school. Coincidentally, so is Wizardiversity. It grew out of that. You can try to fix prior literature. Anybody read Tamara Pierce's Alana books, the Tortall books? They're awesome. They're about a girl that becomes a knight in a land where it's only guys that get to become knights. And it was written as a reaction to all of these guy knight books. Blue Sword by Robin McKinley, similarly, it was a reaction against all of these sweeping desert sagas where it's the guy off on the horse and whatever, and this time they give the girl a sword. You can try to explain a prior thing, like Ella Enchanted does, where she's trying to explain Cinderella. You can honor the past and build on it, like Harry Potter does with Earthsea. You can also, and this one I particularly like, is to ask yourself, what if? At the heart of any story is a what if statement. Now, what if there were dinosaurs in an amusement park? That is the core that's behind Jurassic Park. Now, what if a boy suddenly discovered that he's a wizard? That is the seed behind Harry Potter. So you can get to a story idea by asking yourself, what if? Like, what if fairy tale characters lived in my hometown? That was the core idea that led to my first book, Into the Wild. My original answer to that was Rapunzel would obviously own a hair salon, and I went from there. But you can start with the smallest thing. Now, how do you know if an idea is something you can build on? And one of the ways you can tell is, can you ask it other questions? Like with my idea of the fairy tale characters in my hometown, it begs other questions like, why are they there? What are they doing while they're there? You know, how do they feel about it? How would the daughter of one of them feel about it? You know, what happens if their secret comes out? What happens if the fairy tale wants them back? And because I could ask all these questions, I knew I had enough in there to sustain a full novel. So that's a nice sort of little litmus test is, does it make you ask more? So you can ask yourself that. All right, so say you have an idea that you like. The next thing you need is people to enact that idea, because an idea is just an idea. Let's step back for 1 second, and do you guys want to come up with some of your own what-if statements? Anybody got any suggestions? Yeah?
What if aliens came to the Earth?
What if aliens came to the Earth? That begs there's a whole lot that can spring from that, yeah?
What if the world was coming to an end and you was the only person that could save it?
Yeah, what if the world was coming to the end and you were the only person who could save it? That's great. Like, what do you do? How do you feel? What way could you save it? How is it coming to the end? That's a lot of questions off of that, yeah?
What if the world started running out of food?
What if the world started running out of food? Yeah. Yeah?
What if the pop star got sucked into a magical world?
Yeah, it was such a magical world. Yeah?
What if there was no chocolate in the world?
What if there's no chocolate in the world? Ooh, I like that. That would be horrifying. Yeah? What if you were the only person left on Earth? Yeah? What if candy rules the world? Yeah? What?
What if they talk?
I like that. Yeah?
What if you had no juice with food? The arms. Okay? These are all great. Each of these could read a whole story. You just have to run with it, see what's there, see what other questions it has, and then move to step 2, which is you need some people. Because these are just concepts. And a concept can't run by itself and fill a whole story. It has to happen to somebody. There has to be someone we care about. Whether that someone looks like a person or whether that someone looks like a talking cat or whatever. There needs to be someone we're interested in and interested in seeing what happens to them. Now, there are a couple ways to come up with a character, and some stories will start with the idea of a character. And one way is to take your concept of, what if someone had 3 arms or whatever, and say, who is the person that would be most affected by this happening? And have that be your protagonist. Who would be hurt by this happening if, I'm blanking on some of the ideas, but aliens came to Earth, who would be most affected by this? Who would be influenced? And then figure out, what does that person most want in the entire world? And what does that person most fear? out of anything. And that can drive your story forward. And it's okay if that want and the fear are in conflict. In fact, that's pretty interesting. Like for let's see, which one should I talk about? Into the Wild, with the fairy tale characters. It's about Rapunzel's daughter. And she is terrified that the secret of her family will come out. And at the same time, she wants desperately to belong either to the fairy tale world or her home world, and she's straddling it. And these things are in conflict because she has to hide a piece of herself, and at the same time, she wants to be accepted. And that drives her through the novel. And in A Wizard of Earthsea, Ged, he desperately wants to stop this evil that he created, and he's also horribly afraid of it, because if he catches up to this evil and loses, it could destroy his world. That evil could gain so much power. So his want and his fear are in conflict, and that is driving him through the novel. And that can take you through an entire storyline, is just latching on to that want and that fear. Okay, once you get your idea, and once you get your people, the next thing is they need a world to run around in. World building applies whether you're talking about a fantasy world or the real world. You are casting a spell when you write. You're bringing a world to life with details. And that is kind of a way you can ground it, is to pick out the details that make it come alive. You want to establish the rules. If you're working in a fantasy world and there's magic, you want to establish the rules of magic so that you're not getting to the final chapter and all of a sudden, oh, he can fly and he gets out of his danger because he flies away. That won't work. Nobody's going to buy that. But if you work into the beginning, oh, he's sprouting wings. This is horrible. What is he going to do with wings? How does he wear shirts? He's got wings on his back. Then it's okay if he flies later because you've introduced it to the reader. You're not breaking faith with them. So you want to establish your rules and stick to them, because you're asking, particularly in fantasy, you're asking someone to take a leap and to believe something that's not real. So you need to guide them into it and not break faith with them. You know, if you make a promise in the beginning, this is going to be this kind of story, they're going to expect it. Now, you can turn that expectation on its head, but you should be doing it deliberately, because you're making a promise to the reader, this will be this kind of story.